we've just finished looking at the New Testament and asked the question whether the New Testament documents, is there any way to know whether they've been faithfully and reliably transferred through time to us today? And using the basic principles of textual criticism, we found that, yes indeed, there's good evidence to trust that the New Testament, what we're reading, is actually what was written originally. Now I'd like to ask the same question of the Old Testament. And just a bit of background about the Old Testament. It was written starting from about 1500 BC with the books of Moses to about 400 BC. So it's about an 1100-year time interval from start to end of the Old Testament, written by various authors. Now, just like with the New Testament and with the classical Greco-Roman writings, none of the originals are available to us. So we are looking for copies. That's what we work with. And so what are the copies that we work with? Well, the earliest, up until very recently, the earliest and best copies we used were in a family called the Masoretic text, a family of various manuscript copies. And this family, this Masoretic text, was copied by a group of Jewish scribes that lived in Tiberias on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. And so they've left for us various copies of the Old Testament, and as you can see, they date from approximately the year 900 AD to the year 1000 AD, their earliest ones. So if we draw a timeline here, and here's our timeline, in the green bar is the interval of time which the Old Testament was written, and here we are today at the other end of the timeline. And then we put on the Masoretic text. You can see there's a large time interval from the original writings to the earliest extant manuscripts. It's 1,000+ years. And so this raises a lot of questions, you know, the biggest of which is, you know, has the Old Testament, was it changed in this interval of time from the Old Testament to 900 AD, when we don't have any manuscript copies to check against? Did the Old Testament writings get changed? And now I've mentioned up until very recently because in the mid-20th century a very important archaeological discovery was made. It was made in 1948 by a Palestinian shepherd, and he discovered some sealed jars hidden in caves on the shore of the Dead Sea. This was from an ancient Jewish community called the Qumran community, and these sealed jars contain the community documents of all sorts of types. But among the community documents was contained their holy books, or their documents, and which was the books of the Old Testament. So here in one discovery we have found, let's say, the book of Isaiah and the books of Moses and so on, not in the Masoretic text, but from 1,000 years earlier, preserved for us and discovered 60 years ago in the Dead Sea Scrolls. These Dead Sea Scrolls, because it was a community that lived over several generations, these documents date from a period of roughly 250 to 100 BC, before Christ. They are in Hebrew, and so if we put them here and add those to our timeline, we can see here on our timeline we had the Masoretic text, we have the Old Testament written, and then in one jump we've been able to move back 1,000 years closer to the time period in which the Old Testament was written. And so now we can actually ask a question. We can compare the Dead Sea Scrolls with the Masoretic text and ask how much in those about 1,000-year interval had the Old Testament text changed. This will give us an ability to check that. And what they discovered was there's been no change, except for a few words of spelling. There's been virtually no change between the Dead Sea Scroll text and the Masoretic text. Now when you think, for example, how the English language has changed, even from the 350 years since Shakespeare, how fluid the English language is, and you recognize just in 1,000 years, just a few words of spelling had changed in the Hebrew language, you realize it's such a static language, and it's been faithfully transmitted, at least through this time interval, that we can test now. And Josephus, who's a Jewish historian, lived in the 1st century AD, tells us why, and you can see from his quote here that he tells us that the Jewish people regarded the Old Testament as divinely inspired, and therefore they would, in fear of God, they would not add or take away from them. And so they had a motive to faithfully preserve the text of the Old Testament, and we've seen from comparing the Dead Sea Scrolls with the Masoretic text that they did a good job of doing it. Now it's very important for us especially because now I've superimposed here in the blue, the little blue box with the red dashed circle around it, this is the time interval in which the New Testament was written. Now one of the things that's unique about the Bible is how the various books, even though separated by time, hundreds of years, and many of these authors didn't know each other, they build upon each other. And especially the New and the Old are linked. And so the New and the Old form a unit. Now, there are possible reasons or explanations for that, one of which maybe is a sign that it's divine inspiration behind it. But before we can make that explanation, one of the questions would be, well, maybe the Old Testament had been modified after the New Testament to make it fit the New Testament. In other words, the reason the New and the Old fit like this has nothing to do with divine guidance. It has everything to do with the fact that perhaps, that's the question, the Old Testament was fudged after the New Testament to make them fit. Well, now we know that that's indeed not the case, because now we have manuscript copies that predate, as you can see, they come before the New Testament, and they're exactly the same as the ones that come after. So the Old Testament wasn't changed to make it fit the New Testament. That eliminates one of the possible naturalistic explanations as to why the Old and the New fit together so well. So from this short survey, we can again see that there's been good evidence, data through the textual base to show that the Old Testament, as we read it, has not changed in substance from when it was written originally, way back over 2,000 years.